First of all, thank you, Carlo, and thank you to everyone who's here. It's such an honor to be able to meet you all and to be in the presence of so many amazing storytellers. I am only able to be on a stage like this and live the life I live because of teachers like you. And so I'm so deeply grateful to be here. And of course, my first teachers were my parents, who were two Bengal tigers from Kolkata, who emigrated to Jackson Heights, Queens, in the 1970s. My dad was working baggage claim for JFK, and my mom was a cashier and later on a bank teller and worked as a receptionist. And my dad ended up starting a travel agency of his own and ended up in the 1980s buying 4 acres of land in the mid-Hudson Valley of New York and hiring 2 Irish men to build his house. And as they were finishing the basement, I, at that time, was 2 or 3 years old and would sort of dance in between the tiles that the builders were laying and would sing songs of my own creation. At one point, one of the builders actually sang Danny Boy, Oh Danny Boy, to me. And without knowing it, I just sang the song back to him. And I didn't know anything about what perfect pitch was or have any idea of what musical aptitude was or anything like that. But the builders were the ones who said to my parents, get that kid some music lessons. And so in the place where I grew up, the only 2 instruments available were a piano and a violin. And when I saw the piano, I apparently burst into tears, which is still how the piano makes me feel today. Just a giant piece of furniture. Like, why does it exist? Like, anyway, don't tell pianists that I said this. But the only other option was a violin. And I started taking violin lessons when I was 3.5 years old through something called a Suzuki method. And my first teacher was an apple farmer named Mrs. Christ, who would put out 2 bowls at the ends of her lessons. One was filled with leftover Halloween candy, the other one was Macintosh apples from her trees. You can guess which one was empty at the end of lessons. But that's how I started. I started with the Suzuki method. And so much of Dr. Suzuki's philosophy lives in this room because he never called his method the Suzuki method. He called his method talent education because he believed that talent was innate. It was a mother tongue of every single person, and that if a child could learn a language as complicated as Japanese by ear, why couldn't they learn music the same way? And it took me years to realize that Suzuki was building his method in post-Nagasaki in Hiroshima, Japan. Right? And so his way of making music was literally about rebuilding people from the bottom up, starting with the youngest children. And within 1 decade, he had hundreds and hundreds of children playing together in this kind of supremely disciplined approach, and that is the tradition through which I entered. Well, so one thing about the whole child that's so interesting to think about, especially with Dr. Suzuki's approach that now modern neuroscience has proven, is that children are born with twice as many neurons as adults have. And those neurons will naturally die off if they're not incorporated into circuits. But what we find is that if a child is engaged with cross-hemispheric connection with something that requires the motor cortex and the visual cortex and the audio cortex, those extra neurons will incorporate into circuits. And so we'll actually find that people, and it's not only music, but something about music is a whole brain activity. It actually shows that that person later on not only has higher brain mass and more complicated brain circuitry, but is actually protected from neurodegeneration, like Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease and dementia later on in life. But one of the people who had such a profound impact on my life was one of my first teachers, a woman named Louise Behrend. And she was a graduate of the Juilliard School in the 1940s. She was one of the first women on the faculty of the Juilliard pre-college division. And she also, because she was a complete badass, started her own school in New York City called School for Strings. And she scared the crap out of me. And she scared the crap out of my family, too. And at one point, my dad had come back with a little quarter-sized violin from India that was a kind of unfortunate shade of orange. And was a little bit blockier than perhaps an instrument that was made somewhere else would be. And Miss Barron kind of like wrinkled her nose at the instrument as if it smelled, and she said, "Chubby boy with a fat fiddle." And that's how acerbic she could be. And so at one point, she she was training us. She taught us the Suzuki method. We would have group lessons and individual lessons. And we played our debut at Carnegie Hall with her. I played my debut at Carnegie Hall when I was 8 years old because Miss Barron took us there. And we played a series of Suzuki tunes, and she coached us on the stage, and my dad took me and my brother out for pastrami at Carnegie Deli across the street, and that was his way of celebrating. But Miss Barron's way of celebrating was to do the concert again, and this time at the Rusk Institute in the ward for children with terminal cancers. And she made it very, very clear that if you are going to play at Carnegie Hall, you also have to play everywhere else. And it was only a couple of years ago, I was less than a mile away from this room, playing in Twin Towers Jail, which is effectively the planet's largest psychiatric institution. And I was playing music, and right before I started playing, I kind of gave this cue, and I just saw her. And it's the kind of thing where you realize that you as a person don't really exist. You're an amalgam of all the people who made you. And I feel so privileged that acerbic, sometimes pain in the ass, dogmatic, domineering, totally open-hearted woman made me. Because everything that I am, Street Symphony, the stuff that we'll talk about more and more, my entire philosophy came through her. She said this thing, people listen with their eyes. People listen with their eyes, which is, again, to say this kind of cross-hemispheric synesthetic connection that we have where we can bypass the sort of prefrontal cortex, we can bypass the brain that names things and puts it into categories and return to that world of metaphor, which actually allows us to create new kinds of connections, and to refuse the separation of categories. That's what she taught me.
Can you tell us a little more about what Street Symphony is?
Sure. Well, so I'm an Indian kid whose name is Gupta, so I was supposed to be a doctor. I grew up in a very demanding family. At one point, a somewhat cruel elementary school teacher sort of made a dig at me and my brother because we were both attending Juilliard pre-college very young. And she kind of said something like, oh, well, your kids are spending a lot of time in music. They're not going to be very good at math. And nothing motivated my mother quite like that. Because she took it upon herself to start teaching us pre-calculus. We were 8. Yeah. I started going to college when I was 13. It was not my choice. My major was chosen for me. It was biology pre-med. But I started going to a second college when I was 15. And that was at Manhattan School of Music. And so when I was 15 and 16, I was juggling 30 college credits at the same time. And that was hard for me, but it was even harder for my mother. Because she would literally be driving between upstate New York and New York City 3 times a week. That's 70 miles one way. And she would just sit in the car while I had my lessons, and she would circle the block because there was no place to park in New York City. And all the while, I didn't realize that she was quite sick. And there came a point where my dad's travel agency failed because of 9/11 and because of Priceline.com. And when my parents called me into the living room and said, look, you have a choice. You're going to be a doctor. I didn't get it. I didn't understand. And so I spent 2 years that felt miserable to me, finishing up an undergraduate in biology, leaving music behind. And I got to intern at a number of amazing laboratories. One of them was the Harvard Institutes of Medicine, where I worked in a laboratory studying Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. And I think at some point, people running the lab realized that my heart was so not in it that I was becoming a financial liability to the lab. And I was screwing up routine tests and costing the lab, weeks of work. And the head of the lab took me out for lunch and he said, look, you need to do what makes you leap out of bed in the morning. And that was when I started formulating my escape plan for my family. But it was also the time that I met a researcher who was mentioned in Oliver Sacks's amazing book, musicophilia. And this researcher is named Gottfried Schlaug. And Gottfried Schlaug was studying the impact of music on the brain, but specifically talking about the impact of music on the brain of stroke victims, people who had lost the ability to speak. But he found that even though they couldn't string along the words of a coherent sentence, they could sing and enunciate words that way. And so he literally gave his patients a dose of 80 hours of singing lessons. And he did fMRI, functional MRI scans the whole way through, and found that the brain had literally rewired itself because of singing. And I'm sitting in this lab as an 18-year-old and waiting for him to finish talking, because all I want to talk to him about is the fact that he used to play the organ at the Vienna Conservatory, and I want to ask him, what is it like now to not play music anymore? And so he was one of the ones who said, just go play, like get out of here, go play. And so in 2007, I sort of took a major gamble, and I auditioned just up the hill in this gorgeous stainless steel building that I hope you all get to see, which is Walt Disney Concert Hall. This is where I worked for 12 years. But also to say that it was a dream job. I jumped off a chair and landed on the moon. It was my first audition. It was my first time entering the big leagues. It was an immediate six-figure starting salary. None of my parents had ever had benefits or a pension or dental. Nothing, ever. And now I was the one providing for my family because of music. And I thought, I won. I did it. And then I saw Skid Row for the first time, which is less than a mile from this room. It is the largest community of unhoused people in America. On any given night, upwards of 70,000 people sleep on the streets of this city. This city is a masterclass in structural violence. The first building that was planned in this city is the county jail. We have the largest county jail system on the planet as well, which is $1 billion a year. And I've already mentioned that it's the largest psychiatric facility because there's a revolving door between being homeless and mentally ill in Skid Row and self-medicating and ending up in a cell in Twin Towers jail. That's the revolving door. And when I entered this hotel today from the valet parking lot, I literally walked past a poster of a movie that was filmed somewhat in this building, of a movie called The Soloist. And The Soloist was the story of a man named Nathaniel Anthony Ayers, who was one of the first black men to ever go to the Juilliard School in the 1970s. And in his junior year, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. And the LA Times columnist Steve Lopez told his stories in a series of columns that later became a book, that later became a movie starring Robert Downey Jr. and Jamie Foxx. And I became Nathaniel's friend. And more importantly, he became my guide to Skid Row. Around the time that I joined the orchestra, I started to see Skid Row, and I started to ask myself, why on earth does Los Angeles and the world need yet another conservatory-trained classical violinist to be playing for folks who are, picnickers and pot smokers at the Hollywood Bowl? Not that I have anything against picnicking and pot smoking. But it was a kind of thing where music at the LA Phil was exciting and overwhelming and like drinking from a fire hose, and it was very clearly an entertainment industry. And music had never been a job for me before. In the culture that I grew up in, music was sacred. Music is a form of worship. And so when I saw Nathaniel and I met him, he became a kind of mentor and a reminder to me that music could be a lifeline. We're very close to the 2nd Street Tunnel. That was Nathaniel's practice room. That's where he used to set up milk crates after our lessons to sit down in the tunnel and practice what I had taught him. And so Street Symphony started because I wanted to meet more people like Nathaniel. And I started cold calling shelters and clinics and hospices and chemotherapy wards and VA centers, and people would hang up on me because they thought it was a prank caller, and because they would say, "You're going to bring your Philharmonic here? No one likes that kind of music." Right? And so then I literally started playing at social workers' conferences. And I would drag my LA Philharmonic colleagues with me and kind of lie to them about where exactly we were going. And we ended up playing eventually in shelters and clinics in Skid Row. And one of the first times we played, we were playing this super dramatic piece of Beethoven, this really amazing piece in C minor. It's this sort of like searching, leaping, very anxious music, a string quartet. And by the time I finished that first phrase, a woman in the front row, as close as you're sitting, Carlo, punched her hand into the air, like 6 inches from my face. And I like almost recoiled and fell off the chair because in classical music, we don't sign up for human contact. When I finished the movement, she said, "How did you know that is my music? How did you know? How did you know that that is my story? That this is my mom and dad screaming at each other. This is me hiding my baby sister from them. This is me when I started reaching for the bottle. This is me with the voices in my head. This is me." And she was starting to sing the themes, and I'm like freaking out, sending SOS signals to the social workers in the back of the room who are all very unhelpfully bawling their eyes out because they had never heard the woman speak before. And they said this is the first time she'd been coming to the center, coming to the clinic for years and years and years. The music opened a door in her. Would we please come back and play a concert? So that was 2009, and that was the beginning of Street Symphony. Wow. You know, there's a way that I can answer this question which goes into strategic planning and which goes into how we build capacity, and those are important points to name, and I want to answer that question. But I have to say that the impact on me is what I carry into rooms like this every single day. Because I went to Skid Row very much out of this mindset that I was the expert, that I was the one who was offering the healing power of music to people who I saw as broken. And it was people in those places who held up a mirror to me and said, "Oh, honey, it's so good that you're coming here to walk your steps." And I'd say, "What the fuck are you talking about, walking my steps?" And they'd say, "Yeah, keep coming, keep coming." And it took me years to realize, you know, the UCLA basketball coach, John Wooden, said, "The things we want most in life, peace, love, joy, give them away to get them back."
Absolutely.
Right? So the thing that you long for most, what would it be like to give it away? And so there's no question of us and them. There's no question of how I saw somebody else and what I could teach you, because of course I could say what that is, but the truth is they saw me, and that's why I'm here. The same way that my teachers saw me, and that's why I'm here. The same way that you see your students, and you see your families, and you see your loved ones. So it's to say that when I went into Skid Row and started playing concerts, they were concerts. I thought that I had the answers, and I was humbled and humiliated over and over and over again. Sometimes we'd be stopped in the middle of a concert, and someone in the audience would ask, "Son, don't you know any songs we know?" And then would just start singing. And so there was a kind of freshness in being in Skid Row where people insisted on their story being part of what was being told. And it became very clear to me is that the place where we actually don't allow human connection to happen is the concert hall, not the shelter. And so now the work is, how do we bring connection back to that place that thinks it has the answers, not the other way around? So I'm not answering your question on purpose.
You actually are.
We've presented thousands of events in Skid Row, and now to actually answer your question, I think what's really important to remember is that I get to leave Skid Row. You know, and so when I enter, I have to enter from the position of being a guest, right? And so how do I walk into somebody else's house and offer the very best that I can offer and make the commitment to return again and again and again, right? So going to Skid Row has now become a kind of pilgrimage and a kind of practice of hope where I remember who I am. And the gift that I get back is being reminded of the Samuel Clemens, why I'm here on earth.
Excellent, DJ. Thank you. How do you actually build trust? How do you actually build the connection you just described? What are some ways in which you...
So the currency of trust is relationship. The currency of trust is relationship. And so the work that we do is deeply relational in a place where relationship is tenuous and sometimes impossible, and sometimes even places that have been designed to prevent connection from happening. I'll never forget going into Linwood County Jail, which is the women's jail here, not too far away from here in Compton, and performing for a group of women there. And one of the women in the jail who was incarcerated was pregnant at the time. She was going to deliver her baby while incarcerated. And we had a group of singers performing for the room. And at the end, the woman who was pregnant asked for a hug from one of the singers. And I'll never forget the deputy looked away. Right? The deputy let us have the contact that is forbidden in that room. So that's the impact. And so it's to say that we have to understand too that the metric of success looks very, very different in a place like that. Because the last thing I'm going to do in a shelter or a county jail is hand out a survey and say rank our performance from 1 to 10. Right? Especially for people who are relegated to being considered as a statistic, as a part of the ground level. So we have to find other ways of creating and co-creating that relationship in the room, because that moment of the workshop, of the concert, of the conversation might be all we have, right? And there have been moments where I will have a connection with someone that will be unbelievable, and the next week I will see that that person has relapsed and they're leaning against the building, or I will hear that that person has passed away because of an accidental overdose. So this work has made me very, very aware of this is it. This moment, and then this moment, and then this moment. That's it. That's all we have. And so it's to say, how can I show up in this moment as outwardly, relational as possible, and at the same time inwardly aware of the way in which I'm practicing on myself. In just a moment, we're going to watch a video of a program of Street Symphony, and then I'll talk about a term that I learned from culture bearers from the son jarocho tradition of Mexican music. But it's to say that the relationship that we practice and the quality of relationship we practice has to be made very quickly. And it also means that we have to have a lot of skill when it comes to how we play, how we practice. I spend as much time practicing to be in Skid Row and play our concerts there as I do playing concerts at Disney Hall. Sometimes even more time, because we want to be very, very clear about our intention. When we go to Skid Row, we're often asked, why did you play this music? Why are you playing this for us? I've never asked that question in the concert hall, because that audience has paid good money to not ask that question. Right? Whereas in Skid Row, people will say, why are you playing Beethoven? What is this? And then I have to not say the material that I learned in school of 1770, Bonn, Germany, Heiliger Stadttestament, this opus number, that. No, they want to know the person's story. And so that changes how we play, and it changes the adaptiveness in the room. So we always have to be adaptive to what's going on. I just want to say, Booker just texted me yesterday. He now runs the wellness center at the Midnight Mission. So he's the one who said I came in with no shoes. Yeah. So it's really special. So one of the most terrifying things to me as a classical musician is improvising, because you can give me anything on a page and I can sight read it, but you tell me to make something up and I lose my shit. And so one of the talking about how do we model that trust, how we model that relationship. How do I, as a leader, step into a place of absolute terror and vulnerability, and the same place of vulnerability and terror that I am expecting participants to step into when I am asking them or putting them on the spot, or even my colleagues, my musicians, who I can no longer lie to, in terms of where we're going and playing, because it's been 16 years and they figured it out. But how do I model that myself? And so the musicians you saw, you might have recognized the lead singer. Her name is La Marisol. She's the Grammy Award-winning singer of La Santa Cecilia, and she's singing in Skid Row on Sunday with us. She's a dear friend of ours. And the tradition of son jarocho music is an ancestor of mariachi music. And in the tradition of son jarocho, there's this term called compromiso, which means the shared promise. right? And that is also the relational work, right? The artist has a shared promise to a community to tell the truth, to perform, to show up, to be the curanderas and curanderos, and actually tell the truth. But they also have the shared responsibility to work on their craft. And it's these two poles of relational practice. And for many years, my poles were literally that room, Disney Hall, and Skid Row. And I had stretched myself taut, like a stretched string across poles. And there were many times that cognitive dissonance threatened to break me. And in 2018, I left the LA Film. I left that dream job that was never my dream job. It was somebody else's dream job. And I felt completely unmoored. And it was a year after my father very suddenly passed away. It was a year after I started to grapple with and address my own addiction to alcohol and food. It was the time where I started to become unstrung and undone in my own life in a time of such total despair. And it was actually in going to Skid Row that I learned how to restring myself, how to put myself back together. And so it's that practice of compromiso that if we're going to show up to the world and expect change to happen, it's disingenuous if we are not practicing that same change upon ourselves. Absolutely. The book is called Restrung. It's actually available now for pre-order for anyone who is on social media or on Instagram. You can find it on my page there. I should say, I just announced today that all of my proceeds of the book will support Street Symphony's guitar and songwriting program. The book is the story of my parents. It's the story of how I grew up. It's the story of, you were very kind, Carlo, to introduce me with the accolades. And writing this book started off as me kind of creating a how-to make a street symphony in your community. I'm very lucky to travel all over the country and all over North America talking about the work of street symphony. And I'm always asked, when are you starting this program in Portland, Maine, or Portland, Oregon, or when are you starting this in Chicago? And the thing that I'll first say is, first of all, there are musicians in that community already doing that work, and you can go and find them. And part of the initiative of the book is to create a national blueprint so you can find this work happening in your community right now, because it probably already is happening. But when I started writing about those values like compromiso, or how the currency of trust is relationship, these kind of philosophical sledgehammers meant nothing if I wasn't accounting for my own story. And so I think all of us in the room probably have had the experience where we're both humbled and humiliated by writing because no one applauds at the end of a bad sentence. And writing will unveil the truth to you in ways that make you really, really, really uncomfortable if you're doing it right. And that's what this book is. It's that process of telling my story, telling my family's story. The book is called Restrung because it's based on a poem by the Bengali national poet Rabindranath Tagore, who is one of the first South Asians to win the Nobel Prize. He was also an utter badass who returned his knighthood back to the British because that's the way to do it. He wrote the national anthem of India and of Bangladesh. And one of his poems is, "I have spent my life stringing and unstringing my instrument, but the song I came to sing remains unsung." And so it's the way in which I had strung up my life according to everybody else's rules, right? First, my parents, then my teachers, then conductors, then colleagues, and I managed to eke out what I thought was surviving based on everybody else's metrics while completely crumbling inside. Any time that those accolades are mentioned, there's a part of me that feels like that small boy who ached and didn't get a childhood kind of gets a little bit smaller. And so restringing my story became a way of putting that kid first within myself and learning how to reparent that child. But also realizing, as I mentioned before, the tools, the gifts that I wished to give in Skid Row. I hoped for the healing of people who were recovering from homelessness. I hoped to bring them some beauty. But it was only in realizing that in bringing them beauty again and again, I was allowing the beautiful into my own life. And so it was in Skid Row that I found love. It was in Skid Row that I found a community. And so this is part of the relational practice of this book. And so I do hope that you'll consider looking at Restrung, and that I hope you'll consider telling people about it too, because part of this work is how we can all restring ourselves together. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I think of it musically. It's like playing, it's orchestrating. You know, it's like, how do we actually, and the beautiful thing about making music is that you can make music on your own and you do your practice on your own, but you also find how you can meet somebody else's practice, right? So I can't take the Midnight Mission out for coffee, but I can take Georgia Berkovich out for coffee. Right? And I can take her out to coffee for 16 years so that when I do screw up by saying something stupid in Skid Row, she pulls me aside and says, honey, don't say that again. Right? So that's the kind of thing, right? So the relational practice is building up enough goodwill as much as you possibly can to learn somebody else's language. You know, one thing I realized when my dad passed away was that I am him, because he spoke 5 or 6 different Indian languages, and he would code switch like that. And I learned very quickly that I was doing the exact same thing by code switching between social worker and funder and policymaker and county jail sheriff and musician and conductor, all these various different languages. So that's one thing here. But the coalition building is keeping those relationships intact by showing up again and again and again. And that kind of showing up I don't always have to be perfect. In fact, I should never assume that I am going to show up to a room as perfect when I do show up, which for me as a serial perfectionist took a lot of therapy to realize that that was the case. But you know, part of the other side of coalition building too is to realize that you don't actually have to reinvent the wheel, right? There's a kind of hubris when we think that I'm going to go in there and I'm going to do this and I'm going to start it over and I'm going to, do this sort of thing. So I think that that's the kind of work that we can build towards together, is finding out somebody else's practice and how you intersect with that practice. Right? And so what I want to know from you is, I will learn your values when I learn how you practice. Right? I will learn what you hear that I don't, and you will show me what I'm not hearing that you do. Right? I think I just said the same thing twice, but that's fine.
We understand.
Right? But it's the sort of practice of listening, and how we build that. And that can only happen in person, and it can only happen when you actually show up again and again. I think we're in a really critical time, where it's becoming very easy to be seduced by despair. One of the greatest commodities of our time that everyone is vying for is not just our money or our time, but our attention. And I'm so completely aware of the gift that I'm receiving in this room, because I'm the focal point of your attention, this profound gift that you have given me today. And so there's a kind of stewardship of attention that I think we can think about, right? And the stewardship of attention toward what we say, how we say it, the music behind what we intend, is so important to weigh and take seriously, and take care of your words and of yourselves and the kind of place that you place your attention. I'm about to play a piece of music with you all, because this is going to be a sing-along. Get ready. It's coming. It's coming. By an amazing monk and singer named Leonard Cohen. And Leonard Cohen was a monk not too far away from here. He lived in a Zen monastery on Mount Baldy. And he was given no special dispensation for being a rock star except for one cigarette at 3:30 in the morning every day. And his monastic name was Jikan. And the character in Japanese of Jikan looks like the same character of time, but in the case of Leonard Cohen, it was actually the space between thoughts. So I guess the practice of hope is to protect one's silence. Because it is that space between thoughts where the solution that we cannot arrive at by logical or prefrontal cortex thought will emerge. If we can protect our attention, the answers are right there. So here's Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah. Thank you.